I'll give the floor now to Anthony Bellanger. You have the floor for 8 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Members of the Parliament, my name is Anthony Bellanger. I'm a French journalist. I'm also Belgian, and I have been running this international federation for 12 years. We're based in Brussels, and year on year we see the terrible situation that my colleagues have to work in. I stand before your committee and I see that unfortunately not all the members are here, although this committee does a lot for human rights, as I noticed recently with the chair's team. We worked together on the issue of a Moroccan journalist who was being persecuted in Tunisia. We're trying to get him out of the country, but we haven't managed to do that yet, haven't had a reply. I won't give his name, I don't want to put him in danger, but I just wanted to underline the fact that your committee is capable of reacting to urgent cases where necessary. So the International Federation of Journalists is a professional global organisation, the only one of its type, only journalists and journalist unionists, and we represent journalists in 48 countries, together with the UN and our partner UNESCO, which is responsible for the protection of journalists, that the job has never suffered quite as much attack as it does at the moment. As we heard from Sami in Gaza, it's become a cemetery for civil society, for humanity, and a cemetery for journalists. And there's impunity, complete impunity. Our Palestinian Journalist Union on site, chaired by Nasu Aburaka, who's also part of our international federation, is fighting a battle daily on the West Bank and in Gaza. I've been there a lot over the 11 years that I've been in charge of the federation, twice since the beginning of the war, and they're the worst missions that I've ever had to undertake as a professional. You won't be surprised to hear that. We've seen as well in the US that journalists are under pressure in the US. They're booed, they're criticised by the White House, even having ripple effect in Canada, so tell us the unions there, and I'm going to Canada in 6 weeks. In Turkey, things had appeared calm, but Erdogan's becoming authoritarian again and putting journalists in prison, and it's no holds barred at the moment. We're seeing a global circus where nobody is in control of anybody. The UN is stuck in its impotence and its dependence on the major powers. Europe is bigger but doesn't dare get involved in case it upsets its economic competitors. And it's the nuclear powers, Paris and London, who are trying to make the plays. Trump, Netanyahu, Putin, Erdogan are doing whatever they want. Just a moment, I'm having a little hiccup with my computer. That is what the world looks like in 2025. And then we've got Taiwan is the only thing that we could add to this terrible portrait. We've got Burkina Faso has kidnapped 3 journalists just on Saturday, and 2 of them are representatives of our federation in Burkina Faso. No international institution has reacted. So, of course, and then you have the junta in Myanmar persecuting journalists after the earthquake because they are documenting the government's acts of murder and cruelty. But journalists have to continue doing their job, informing themselves and the public. That is, at least when they are allowed in. As Sami has said, foreign reporters haven't been allowed into Gaza to cover the war there. And that, of course, goes against freedom of circulation and international law. Now, I was asked before I came here what problems journalists around the world were faced with. And I have to say, you would need to talk for hours and hours. I would need to explain things for hours and hours. We're in 148 countries, and there's something going on in all of those countries, pretty much. Journalists are faced with a number of challenges that undermine their opportunity to carry out their work safely and freely. I have split this into three: access to information, protection, safety, and security. Access to information. Well, I won't go into this in too much detail. I don't want to say anything about AI. You'll be familiar with that. But in a number of countries, access to public information is restricted, either because of anti-terrorist laws or national security restrictions. France would be an example I could give from not too far away. Governments are expanding the definition of classified information, which makes it difficult for journalists to find information to share with the public. Journalists need to overcome more and more obstacles that are put in their path when they ask for public documents, and that access can be limited arbitrarily. Even when access commissions give judgments, they're only indicative, as is the case in Luxembourg. And some governments use disinformation or just block access to information and sensitive areas. That's the case in Ukraine, the occupied territories in Ukraine, where, of course, media coverage is very much restricted and indeed dangerous. We had more deaths recently in these areas, 2 journalists from Russia, and we've had Ukrainian journalists and foreign journalists die as well, of course. Other journalists are thrown in prison. Because they have gone against the rules that have been set by Ukraine or Russia. So they're basically being thrown in prison for doing their job. Protection and security of journalists. Now, this is something that occupies us on a day-to-day basis. Journalists are often attacked, physically attacked, intimidated, or people try their attempts to kill them. And that goes on in Europe as well. In 2024, the Council of Europe platform that the International Federation of Journalists contributes noted 78 physical assaults on journalists in Europe, and that included killings and imprisonments. And in 2024, around the world, we noted 128 journalist deaths. 2/3 of those were in Palestine, and 14 of them were women. That's an extremely high number as well. We've also counted, as best we can, 516 journalists in prison. More or less, we don't have exact figures. Demonstrations also mean that there's a more likelihood of police violence against journalists, according to the Council of Europe. And I'm just talking about Europe. I'm not talking about Cameroon or Argentina, Somalia, Myanmar. Communications are bugged. There's monitoring of journalists' search for information. Particularly, we see that in authoritarian regimes. Kurdistan, Iraq, where I was a few weeks ago. Turkey is doing that. Or I was in Azerbaijan recently. Defamation rules or the abusive law cases, the slap are used to muzzle journalists. Anti-slap measures have been taken in Europe, but they're completely insufficient to do the job. Turning now to the job security for journalists. Freelance journalists often have to sign contracts that don't involve social security or legal protection for them when they're doing their work. They have to take on the risk themselves. This happened for the AFP correspondent recently. One of my colleagues is negotiating that issue at this very moment. Same goes in Cameroon, where the payment is really theoretical, the actual wage for many freelance. That goes for many countries in Africa, and the amount of money is not enough to live, and so people have to have a second job, which of course means that they're in a weaker position to speak to people when they arrive with their card press, if they have a press card where they're reporting. The drop in prices in the media world is making that even worse, because the big platforms are really squeezing journalists and their work. They don't want to pay copyright when, for example, information that journalists have gathered is used. Then you've got insurance for journalists. We've negotiated one for journalists who go on mission, but again, the insurance companies want to take fewer and fewer risks. And let's not forget that security is a big issue for journalists when they're on mission. It should be the employer who takes responsibility for the safety of their journalists. Now, I've been teaching for the last 5 years in a journalist academy near Brussels, and I have to say, wanting to be a journalist when you're 20 in the current situation is quite something. We want our future journalists to understand the situation. We need journalists in the world we live in now. We need independent journalists now. And that's why we and the other journalists here and the members of our international federation fight every single day, and for the last 30 years, in my case, so that journalists can live from the high-quality work that they do. Thank you.
Notre dernier intervenant en ligne, Monsieur Renaud.